We live in a world in which there are many aspects of international law. For years, countries, organizations, financial institutions, businesses, and religious institutions have agreed to respect international rules. Of the many rules of behavior that should be respected in the international sphere, one of the most important is human rights. The United Nations has the task of defining most aspects of international law on human rights, but is not able to enforce respect for them. The protection of human rights is instead the responsibility of everyone. Let's look at the example of the World Bank. The World Bank is, in principle, an institution created to end extreme poverty. It works like a regular bank, except that its clients are states rather than individuals. Some countries that borrow from the World Bank are responsible for serious human rights abuse, but the World Bank has no policy to respect international agreements on human rights. This means that many World Bank borrowers get large loans despite having low human rights standards. If the World Bank complied with international human rights laws and incorporated them into its social protection policies, the situation with respect to these could be improved in many countries. Let's focus on freedom of religious belief. Here are 6 countries that support or condone religious persecution, yet receive substantial funding from the World Bank. Most of these countries have ratified international treaties that protect the human right of freedom of belief, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights obligates state parties to prohibit by law any religious hatred which constitutes incitement to discrimination. The Covenant distinguishes freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief from the freedom to manifest that religion or belief. It does not permit any limitations whatsoever on freedom of thought and conscience, or on the freedom to adopt a religion or belief of one's choice. These freedoms are protected unconditionally, as is the right of everyone to hold opinions without interference. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights guarantees that the rights identified in the treaty will be exercised without discrimination of any kind, including religion. For example, persons belonging to a religious minority must not be denied equal access to universities, employment, or health services on the basis of their religion. Finally, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination is based on the principles of dignity and equality inherent in all human beings. All member states have pledged to take joint and separate action for the achievement of the United Nations goal to promote and encourage universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Unfortunately, this commitment is often only tangible on paper. Let's see why. Pakistan. 14 people were killed and more than 70 injured when 2 Taliban suicide bombers attacked Christian churches in Pakistan's Lahore on March 15, 2015. The bombings occurred during prayers at 2 Christian churches located around half a kilometer apart in the city's Yohanabad neighborhood, home to more than 100,000 Christians. The Pakistani Taliban splinter group claimed responsibility for the twin explosions. The government has been criticized for its lack of protection of Christian minorities, and police often do not take sufficient action against perpetrators. Pakistan has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, thereby committing to respect freedom of belief. However, authorities continue to enforce blasphemy laws as a means to restrict religious freedom. The government has failed to take the required measures to stop major violent incidents. Despite this, the World Bank provided Pakistan with $6.6 billion from 2011 to 2015. China prosecuted family members of self-immolators and imprisoned and tortured Falun Gong practitioners. Falun Gong is a Chinese spiritual discipline for mind and body. Police continue to harass members of house churches and unregistered Catholic bishops and priests. However, freedom of religion is provided for in China's constitution, and China has ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. From 2010 to 2014, the World Bank provided China with $7.8 billion. Burma. From June to October 2012, Rohingya Muslims, men, women, and children, were killed in Burma. Some were buried in mass graves while their villages and neighborhoods were razed. While state security forces occasionally intervened to prevent violence and protect fleeing Muslims, they often stood aside during attacks or directly supported the assailants, committing killings and other abuses. Burma has not signed the international treaties concerning the right of freedom of belief. Despite this lack of commitment toward the protection of human rights, the World Bank has lent it $982 million since 2013. Russia. On September 6, 2011, a criminal case was initiated against Alexei Nikolaev, a Jehovah's Witness from Cheboksary. He was charged with inciting hatred and denigrating human dignity simply for sharing his beliefs with others. On September 7, 2011, Alexei Nikolaev and 2 other Jehovah's Witnesses were put in a detention facility where they spent 48 hours. In addition, 4 premises used for worship services were searched. Between October 2011 and April 2012, 16 searches were conducted in the apartments of Jehovah's Witnesses. Religious persecution is a high concern in Russia, despite the country's ratification of the 2 international covenants and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Russia has gotten $295 million from the World Bank since 2011. Uzbekistan. On October 24, 2014, the private home of mother and son Durdona Abdullayeva and Ulugbek Kenjayev, both members of the Full Gospel Church, was raided. On November 11th, Judge Sherzad Yoldashev of Tashkent's Sergeli District Criminal Court fined each of them 30 times the minimum monthly salary, or about 1,060 euros, for the illegal production, storage, or importation of religious materials. Between 10,000 and 12,000 people reportedly remain imprisoned on vague charges of religious extremism due to their religious beliefs or practices. There are reports of deaths in custody, torture, beatings, and other harsh treatment of prisoners considered to be religious extremists by the government. Uzbekistan has ratified the 3 core treaties on freedom of belief. Uzbekistan has received $1.5 billion from the World Bank since 2011. Tajikistan. Police in Vadat arrested and jailed 2 Muslim men after raids on their homes on December 15, 2014. Criminal cases have been opened against them for teaching school-aged children the Quran and Islam in their homes. Tajikistan is the only country in the world in which the law prohibits persons under the age of 18 from participating in public religious activities. Muslim women are also effectively barred from attending mosques under a religious edict enforced by the government. The country has ratified the major human rights agreements. The World Bank provided $295 million to Tajikistan since 2010. These examples show that the protection of human rights must not only be the task of the United Nations. The World Bank, as a subject of international law, also has its part to play. If the World Bank does not incorporate international human rights law in its policies, it will continue to finance countries with poor human rights protection, including religious persecution. The World Bank is currently reviewing its policies. Now is the moment to change and incorporate human rights standards into its policies and accomplish World Bank development goals by having a real impact in the fight of extreme poverty and ensuring the respect of human rights in all World Bank projects. The solution is for the World Bank to recognize international human rights law and adopt human rights impact assessment procedures. Please write to World Bank President Jim Kim and ask him to ensure that the funding developing countries receive will in no way violate basic human rights, including freedom of religion.